All right, First and Second Chronicles for beginners. This is the first class. The subtitle of this series is Things Left Over, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. This is lesson number 1 in this series, Introduction to Chronicles, and we're going to cover chapters 1 to 9. A little background about these books. The Hebrew name for Chronicles is words of the days, or events of the days. The Hebrew word davar occurs 1,441 times with a wide range of meanings. It may suggest the words of the prophets and seers in those days, as well as the important events of the vast times over which Chronicles concerns itself, because you have information over several centuries that are contained in these two books. Translators of the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd century BC chose to call it the paralipomenon in the Greek, which is things left over. So that's where that subtitle comes, things left over. In the Greek, in the Septuagint, and I think I've explained this before, the Septuagint was the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek language. The Septuagint meaning the translation of the 70 scholars were recruited to create this translation. So the translators split the unified book into two, and they placed it after Samuel and Kings. The somewhat derogatory title of Things Left Over almost makes it seem unimportant, contributed to the neglect of Chronicles and the erroneous perception that it was just a restatement of Samuel and Kings. Nothing there, it's just a repeat of what took place in these other series. However, we're going to see that it gives so much more. The New Testament contains 68 allusions to and verbal parallels with Chronicles, notably in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation. Chronicles' many unique contributions are well worth our time, our attention, and our application. Not easy reading, lots of genealogies and so on and so forth, but I think we'll get something out of it if we dig a little deeper. So as we transition from our study of 1st and 2nd Kings to now 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it is essential to recognize both the continuity and the divergence between these historical books of the Old Testament. Together, these texts provide a multifaceted perspective on Israel's history, very important, revealing the richness of God's work among His people. So let's begin by noting several similarities and differences between 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So let's begin with some similarities. First of all, both 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles recount significant events in Israel's monarchy, such as the reigns of David and Solomon, the construction of the temple, and the division of the kingdom into Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. So both books cover this information. Also, there's a focus on leadership. These books highlight the role of kings in shaping the spiritual and political life of the nation. Both texts evaluate rulers based on their faithfulness to God, emphasizing covenant obedience as the gold standard for leadership. And then another similarity is the theological purpose of both of these books. While recounting history, both Kings and Chronicles serve as theological narratives. They underscore God's sovereignty, His justice in responding to sin, His mercy in preserving a remnant of His people despite their repeated failures and faithlessness. So some of the similarities between these books, a couple of differences. First, different perspective and audience. 1st and 2nd Kings were likely written during or shortly after the Babylonian exile, focusing on explaining the reasons for Israel's downfall and exile. In contrast, 1st and 2nd Chronicles were composed after the exile, primarily for the returned community to offer them hope and to emphasize their spiritual heritage. Another difference, the scope of the narrative. Chronicles focuses more narrowly on the southern kingdom of Judah and the Davidic line, while Kings provides a broader account of both Israel and Judah, the north and the south. This narrower focus in Chronicles highlights God's covenant with David and the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem and in the life of the Jews. And then a third difference to note is the tone and the emphasis of these books. Chronicles often omits negative details about certain kings, especially David and Solomon, in order to present an idealized vision of their reigns. This contrasts with the more unvarnished accounts in Kings, which include their flaws and their failures. Chronicles' tone reflects its intent to inspire the post-exilic readers with a sense of continuity and divine purpose. They needed encouragement after returning from exile, and Chronicles was meant to provide that encouragement. So as we delve into 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we'll see how these books reinterpret Israel's history to emphasize God's enduring covenant and the centrality of worship in the life of His people. While Kings ends with exile, Chronicles concludes with hope, a call to rebuild and to renew both the physical temple and the spiritual identity of God's people now that they have come back to the homeland. This transition invites us to consider how our own lives might align with God's ongoing redemptive work in history and in our personal faith journeys today. So there are lessons in these books that we can draw on for our own lives and our own faith today, and we'll touch on some of these as we go on. And so we move on from differences and similarities to a critical introduction. Critical introduction is just the date it was written, who wrote it, the circumstances, so on and so forth. So we do that in each introduction of all the books that we teach here at Bible Talk. So the authorship of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is traditionally attributed to Ezra, though the text itself does not specifically name an author. Modern scholarship often refers to the author as the chronicler. Internal evidence suggests that the author was likely a priest or a Levite due to the significant emphasis on the temple, the priesthood, and worship practices. Chronicles was written after the Babylonian exile, likely between 450 and 400 BC, during the Persian period. This dating is supported by references to the return from exile and the genealogies extending to that period that you read in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verses 1 and 2 rather. The post-exilic community faced challenges of rebuilding their identity, rebuilding their faith, and their worship practices. And so the chronicler wrote to encourage this community by reminding them of their heritage and God's enduring promises. The returnees needed to see themselves as part of a continuous covenant history connected to the Davidic line and to the temple worship that preceded their era. As far as purpose is concerned, I've touched on that a bit so far. The overarching purpose of Chronicles is to reaffirm God's faithfulness to His covenant people and to inspire their hope for the future. Specific purposes include the following. First, a restoration of their national identity. Chronicles highlights the lineage of David, the centrality of Jerusalem, and the temple to reestablish a sense of identity for the returned exiles. They've been away for decades. Many of them had settled and had begun a new life in Babylon. And so when they came back to Israel, when they came back to their homeland to the city of Jerusalem, everything was in ruins. They had to rebuild their society. And so the book of Chronicles helps them understand that they're part of something bigger. There's something that came before them, and there is something that will continue after them. And the temple, their worship, and their continuing faithfulness was central to their identity as God's people. And Chronicles reaffirms this reality in their minds. A second purpose was to encourage them in worship. By focusing on the temple, the priesthood, and prescribed worship practices, the chronicler sought to renew proper worship practices among the people. Again, they had been exiled because they had abandoned the worship practices given to them by God and had been in a pagan land, as I say, for 70 odd years. And so the book of Chronicles helps them to renew proper worship practices now that they are rebuilding the temple. And then a third purpose was theological reflection. Chronicles interprets Israel's history through a theological lens, emphasizing themes of repentance, covenant loyalty, and divine sovereignty. So let's take a look at the structure and the content. So Chronicles is divided into 2 books, as I said, but it forms a cohesive narrative. It's not that you have a different story in 2 Chronicles than you do in 1. They just follow each other. And let me give you the outline of that structure. First, the genealogies. 1 Chronicles chapter 1 to 9. That's pretty difficult reading, the complicated names and verses and verses of genealogy, 9 chapters. But these chapters establish continuity from Adam all the way to the post-exilic community. And they emphasize God's providential care. I mean, it's not just a genealogy going back 20 years. I mean, it goes back all the way through human history, showing that God had a special purpose for the people, and their names were preserved throughout the centuries. Also, we see David's reign in 1 Chronicles chapters 10 to 29. Chronicles presents David as the ideal king, highlighting his preparations for the temple and his covenant relationship with God. Then we have Solomon's reign. That's in 2 Chronicles chapters 1 to 9. Solomon's wisdom and the construction of the temple demonstrate God's blessings and the centrality of worship for the Jewish people. And then in 2 Chronicles chapters 10 to 36, we have a chronicle, if you wish, of the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom. The narrative focuses on Judah's kings, evaluating their reigns based on their faithfulness to God. It concludes with the exile and the decree of Cyrus, offering hope for restoration. There are some key themes in 1 and 2 Chronicles, first of which is covenant and kingship. Chronicles emphasizes God's covenant with David and the legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty. It also reviews the central role of the temple, reflected in the importance of worship and maintaining that covenant relationship. The Jews maintained the covenant relationship with God, and we've talked about this in previous studies. The covenant relationship basically said, if you obey me, I'll bless you. If you disobey me, I'll punish you, I'll curse you. That was the covenant. That was the covenant relationship. And that covenant relationship was worked out, if you wish, through worship, through the practice of worship at the temple. So the central role of the temple reflects the importance of worship in maintaining the covenant relationship. It was the primary way that they demonstrated their fidelity to the covenant that they had with God. Another theme is repentance and restoration. The chronicler highlights instances of repentance and divine mercy, demonstrating God's readiness to restore those who turn to Him. And then divine sovereignty, an important theme. Chronicles underscores God's control over history, including his judgment and of course the deliverance of his people. I mean, the very fact that a foreign king would simply, without any political lobbying, without any personal interest, would suddenly declare that the Jewish people are free to return home and provide the funds for them to go back and to rebuild their temple and their lives. I mean, that's just, it's miraculous when you look at the rest of history and how kings operated. So the decree of Cyrus to begin the process of returning the Jews to their homeland was a demonstration of God's power, not only over the Jews, but over world affairs. And at the time, Cyrus was the king, the most powerful person in the world. I mentioned that there are genealogies. The first 9 chapters are a little tough reading. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about genealogies, since there's so many of them in this book. Let's begin with the production and the transmission of these biblical genealogies. Biblical genealogies, as seen in the books like the book of Genesis, for example, has them, the book of Chronicles, as we know, and even in the New Testament, the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, all of these contain genealogies. These genealogies, wherever they appear, were carefully compiled, often serving theological and social purposes rather than merely historical or biological ones. These genealogies were produced through oral traditions, written records, and divine inspiration or divine guidance. Over time they were edited, they were refined by scribes and priests who sought to preserve the accuracy and the relevance of these lists for their contemporary audiences. And so we see several important points about the production and the transmission of these genealogies. First of all, the oral traditions. In ancient Israel, genealogies were initially preserved through oral transmission. Families and clans passed down their lineage to affirm inheritance rights and tribal identities and covenantal relationships with God, to prove their covenantal relationship with God. As literacy increased and Israel's society became more centralized, genealogies began to be recorded in official archives. The temple scribes, particularly during the monarchy, maintained detailed records for administrative and religious purposes. And then after the Babylonian exile, genealogies were revisited and updated by post-exilic leaders like Ezra and the chronicler. These revisions emphasized continuity with Israel's pre-exilic heritage, and they reinforced the community's identity as God's chosen people. How do you know you're God's chosen people? Right there, there's my name, there's the name of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and then and so on and so forth. They had these records to demonstrate a continuity of their history, even though at one time they were a united kingdom, and then there was a civil war and there was a divided kingdom, and then the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria, and then the southern kingdom was carried off into captivity by Babylon, and then under the Persian rule they came back and rebuilt the temple, and so many changes in history, so on and so forth. The one constant in all of this chaotic history from their perspective was that the genealogies demonstrated that God was their God. They were the faithful people of God, and they had these genealogical records to demonstrate and to prove this very thing. Some of the purposes of biblical genealogies. First, they affirm God's covenant faithfulness by tracing the lineage of key figures like Adam, Abraham, David, and ultimately Jesus Christ himself. Also, genealogies established legal claims to land, priestly duties, and royal succession. That's how they figured out who would be king, or who would be who would be serving as a priest, or who would live where. All of these things were determined by referring to the genealogies. They also fostered unity among the Israelites by reminding them of their shared ancestry and their divine calling. And then, of course, genealogies pointed to the fulfillment of God's promise, particularly the coming of the Messiah through David's time. And of course, this we see in the genealogies provided by Matthew in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. There are some features about genealogies that are similar, some typical features of biblical genealogies. And I'd like to discuss several of these distinctive features. First of all, there are the selective lists. They often omit certain names, for example, or generations to achieve a theological or a numerical symmetry. For example, Matthew, his first division into 3 groups of 14 generations. So some names are left out, some names are added, to have that symmetry, that numerical symmetry. That's one of the features of these biblical genealogies. Another one has to do with numbers. Numbers hold symbolic significance with patterns such as 7 or 10, indicating completeness or divine order. Another feature is inclusion of non-Israelites. Some of the genealogies highlight the inclusion of outsiders such as Rahab and Ruth to underscore God's universal purposes, that His purpose is not just for the Jews. The Jews are a people He's using to achieve His greater goals, which will affect all of humanity. Also, certain names are highlighted or elaborated upon to draw attention to their significance in salvation history. And then there are variations in genealogical records as seen in the differing genealogies of Matthew and Luke that reflect differing theological emphases or sources of the traditions. So those are some of the features. There are also some idiosyncrasies of biblical genealogies. For example, there are gaps and there are omissions. Intentional gaps often serve theological purposes rather than simply reflecting historical inaccuracy. Some genealogies include overlapping lifespans of figures with the same names, creating interpretive challenges. Many modern scholars point to this, for example, as a problem. Early genealogies, such as those in Genesis, attribute extraordinary ages to patriarchs, reflecting theological symbolism rather than modern chronological precision. Again, one of the complaints of modern scholars. And then, of course, covenantal lineage. Genealogies prioritize covenantal lines. For example, Seth over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, to underscore their divine election in God's plan. And then there are some examples of notable genealogies. The genealogy in chapter 5 of Genesis and chapter 10. These genealogies trace humanity's origins and the dispersion of nations, emphasizing God's sovereignty over His creation. Of course, the genealogies that we're studying in I Chronicles chapters 1 to 9, these begin with extensive genealogies to affirm the post-exilic community's continuity with Israel. I mean, it was a heritage of patriarchs and monarchs that they had, and they could prove this because their names were intermingled with the names of kings and so on and so forth. And then the lineage that we see in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, these New Testament genealogies establish Jesus's messianic credentials, with Matthew focusing on legal lineage through Joseph, and Luke emphasizing biological descent through Mary. That's why we have 2 genealogies in the New Testament as far as Jesus is concerned. And so biblical genealogies are far more than just a list of names. They are rich theological narratives that reflect God's covenant faithfulness, His providence, and also His redemptive purposes. Their production and transmission involve a complex interplay of oral tradition, written documentation, and inspired editing, ensuring their relevance for both ancient and modern readers. And so by studying these genealogies, we gain a deeper insight into the unfolding story of God's work in history and His ultimate plan for humanity. And so let's look at the genealogies in 1 Chronicles chapters 1 to 9. And I'll simply review them very quickly, what each one tells us or what each one is about. The Chronicles begins with, as I said, extensive genealogies to affirm the post-exilic community's continuity with Israel's past leaders and people. So let's take a look. We begin in chapter 1. Chapter 1 traces humanity's history from Adam to Abraham, emphasizing universal origins and narrowing the genealogy down to the covenant line of the Jewish people, beginning with Abraham. In 1 Chronicles 2, the book focuses on the descendants of Judah, highlighting the royal lineage leading to David. Chapter 3 details David's lineage, including the post-exilic descendants, underscoring the continuity of the Davidic line. In 1 Chronicles 4, we have lists of the descendants of Judah and Simeon, with special mention of prayerful Jabez, the famous book that came out several years back. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, reflecting spiritual aspirations. Chapter 5, the tribes of the east of Jordan are mentioned, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, noting their military strength and of course their faith struggles. Chapter 6 focuses on the tribe of Levi, emphasizing priestly duties and the centrality of worship. Chronicles 7 documents the smaller northern tribes, Issachar, Benjamin, Naphtali, Manasseh, Ephraim, and Asher, reflecting the diversity that they had within their society. Chronicle 8 revisits the tribe of Benjamin with an extended genealogy underscoring King Saul's origins. And finally, in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, lists the inhabitants of Jerusalem post-exile, highlighting the Levites and the priests' role in a temple service. So as you see, each chapter has a different genealogy, and each genealogy has a different purpose. And so, believe it or not, we can draw some lessons from just the first 9 chapters that simply give us genealogies. 2 applications, if you wish, that we can kind of take home with us. The first application is this: God is faithful. God is faithful. Recognizing God's faithfulness in history, that's one of the purposes of the genealogies. These genealogies in 1 Chronicles demonstrate how God's providence has preserved His people through generations. And as we reflect on these records, we're reminded of God's unwavering faithfulness to His promises. In our relationship with God, we can trust that His plans for us are rooted in His eternal purpose. We're part of this. We're not just studying, that's not just about those people. We're part of this plan of God, even into the modern day, His eternal purpose. Just as He sustained the line of David and preserved Israel's heritage, He'll preserve our faith, He'll preserve our souls, our place in the lineage of those who are believers. This calls us to live with assurance and gratitude, knowing that we are part of God's ongoing story. Application number 2. Remember who we are. We need to understand our spiritual identity. The chronicler's emphasis on genealogies helped the post-exilic community reconnect with their identity as God's chosen people. Similarly, we are called to remember our spiritual identity in Jesus Christ, who connects us to the covenant promises. Reflecting on our role in God's family inspires us to live as His faithful children in this day and age, embracing our responsibilities in worship, in service, and in community. Just as each name in the genealogies mattered, our lives are significant in God's kingdom as well. Our names are also recorded, but they're recorded in the book of life. Revelation chapter 20, verse 12. And so biblical genealogies are far more than lists of names. They are rich theological narratives that reflect God's covenantal faithfulness throughout the centuries. They also demonstrate His providence and His redemptive purposes. Their production and transmission involve a complex interplay of oral tradition, written documentation, and inspired editing, ensuring their relevance for both ancient and modern readers today. By studying these genealogies, we gain deeper insight into the unfolding story of God's work in history and His ultimate plan for all of humanity, not just for the Jewish people. All right, so there's a review of the first 9 chapters of II Chronicles. A little bit about genealogies themselves, their importance, their idiosyncrasies, similarities, so on and so forth. And so as assignment, I'm going to ask you to reread chapters 1 to 9 and keep in mind the things that I've shown you in this lesson, and then go ahead and read I Chronicles chapter 10 to 29, and we will cover that material in our next lesson. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for your attendance. We'll see you next time if the Lord is willing.